All right. So this is like, this subject kind of ticks all of my boxes. It involves all kinds of different things that I'm interested in. It's a history of an attempt to build socialism that failed. So that's interesting, because whatever happens, we can learn something from that. It's as you can see over here, there's all these connections, and the name cyber is kind of scattered throughout. There's systems and models and things like that. It's about computer science. It's a small part of the history of computer science, and that's another thing I'm interested in. If you study computers and languages for a long enough time, eventually you wonder, why do we have the computers that we have? Why do we have the internet that we have? Was there ever a possibility of doing something different? Is there still a possibility of doing something different? And Cybersyn, Project Cybersyn, is a small, for a very brief period, it presented some sort of alternative to the kind of main line of computer science. So that's interesting to me, maybe not to you, but I'm just saying this is like one of my favorite subjects. And the other thing I like about this is that it didn't happen this was a revolutionary period, right? But it doesn't happen in a semi-colonial country that was under, partially, under the control of an imperialist power, like in China, right? There was no civil war that led to this happening. There was no monarchy in power that had to be smashed or whatever before you could build socialism. This happened in 1970. Chile has had a 25-year, 35-year history of stable liberal democracy, smooth changes in power, people losing elections and giving up voluntarily, like people sticking to their term limits. All these things that I guess are the hallmarks of the political system that we have in this country. I mean, it's, Republicans for 8 years, Democrats, and it kind of, there's no third party or whatever, but there's no violent coups or massacres whenever somebody refuses to give up power or something like that. People generally kind of play by the rules, and this was the case in Chile. So a socialist, somebody who promised to take a particular society from capitalism into socialism, won an election on that platform and tried to do it within the context of an already existing, like I said, liberal democracy. And to me, that's closer to our situation here than China or Russia, even though those were inspiring, periods in history. I don't think there's a whole lot about pre-revolutionary Russia that we can apply directly to what's going on today. There's no czar, there's no although I was about to say that there's no church that controls everything, man, we're in Utah, so I don't know. But it's not the same thing. The LDS Church doesn't own vast tracts of land and employ peasants, so it's a little bit different. So anyway, that's why, those are the three reasons why I like this subject. So this is the timeline, and we should go through that first so that you have everything in your mind. You see this word here, coup. It doesn't end well for anybody involved in this project. Most of the engineers that worked on it were either killed or fled the country. Salvador Allende, who was the president who was elected in 1970 in Chile, shot himself with an AK in the palace on September 11th, 1973. And the whole system that he and the engineers developed was dismantled. So that's where we're going. That's the end. It didn't work. It begins, though, in 1970, where, as I was talking about, Salvador Allende is elected president. He is elected, it's not outright. There was an election, and his party, which was called Popular Unity, won 35 or 36% of the vote, which is fairly low, but there were three major coalitions of parties that were contesting the election, and that was actually the most. But it was so close, he was so close to the other main opponent, that it actually, I think this happens in the US too, if there's a tie in the Electoral College, it goes to the Senate or something like that. There's a tiebreaker basically, and that had to happen in Chile. And he was chosen basically by the Senate, by the constitutional assembly that was picked to basically pick the president from among the two or three people who could have won it. So he's elected, not without problems, 35% of the vote, And immediately they start a program of nationalization. That's one of the things that he promised. He promised land reform, breaking up large estates, giving them to small producers, selling them, whatever. He also promised comprehensive nationalization of what are called the commanding heights of the economy, right, in the Leninist sense. So, what? Say that?
So, I'm trying to remember, Salvador, what country was this?
This is Chile.
Chile? Oh.
Yeah.
That's why I just wanted to make for sure I was in the right frame of
Right,
mind.
yeah. I guess I should have drawn like a picture of the country or something. I have everything else up here.
No,
So.
I remember most of these names. I just, I wasn't sure where from.
Right, yeah.
Trying to get the connecting grid in my head.
Okay, cool. Where was I? So it's after November 1970, early 1971. Steel factories, copper mines are being nationalized. A small company called Kennecott, some of you may have heard, actually owned one of the largest copper mines in Chile at the time, and the government gave them a great deal on it. Most of these nationalizations were forced purchases, so they would show up and the company would say, well, this factory is worth, $10 million or whatever, And the government would say, okay, well, here's a bag of money with $10 million in it. You're gone, we run the factory now. And we're gonna make all the decisions that you formerly made, and that happened. Copper was one of the very first things that was nationalized, and it's actually still nationalized, even after because the military government takes over at the end of 1973, and they roll back a lot of these changes. One of the things that they kept was copper. They held on to that, and it's still a state-owned enterprise.
So what do you mean by nationalized?
So the process of nationalization, the kind of what I talked about last time. A little bit, like the state takes control of what was formerly a private firm. Just a particular company or a mine or something like that. So it's not, there's a lot of times they kept the same management and they didn't fire any workers and they didn't change the machines, but the state was deciding how many people were going to be hired, what they were going to be paid, what was going to be produced, and they would even set for factories that produce consumer goods, they would even decide like prices and like the design of, they designed a new pickup, for instance, or they designed a new record player, like when they took over the record player factory. So, so that happens during this short period after Allende is elected, and they would appoint people. So maybe I shouldn't get into that yet, but they would appoint typically one state employee. Like they would nationalize the firm, take it over, and they would put one of their own men, men typically. This is management, and it all had to be like very male dominated. I didn't read anything about like women participating in this system at all, which is, we'll get into that's under like the criticisms of Project Cybersyn, but that comes later. And they would appoint these people called interventors, which that's actually a Spanish word. I'm not sure what the exact etymology is, but it sounds to me like a combination of intervention and like inventor. And I'm not sure if that's what it means in Spanish too, but these were people that were like appointed by the state to go into a factory and run it, for the government basically.
I think it means that they intervene.
Okay, I figured. I just wanted to make sure there wasn't like.
That's an inference.
Okay, yeah. So these people were appointed to run all these factories that were nationalized in this short period. And that worked sort of well. The first thing is the bottom fell out of the copper market. So the main kind of export that Chile would get hard currency with was not making as much money for them. So immediately they had some problems with that. That was not having to do with Allende. That wasn't really his fault. It's just, the vagaries of the market. But there were problems with a lot of the other nationalized firms. Some of them were doing well because the interventors were good at their jobs. Some people were obviously not as good at their jobs, and there were shortages and things were getting fucked up. So they needed some way to figure out who was doing well and who wasn't. They needed some way to bring all of these enterprises that they had taken over kind of haphazardly, bring them together, have them communicate with each other. Because if you think about it, if you own a car factory, now if you nationalize a car factory and then you nationalize a steel factory and all of the inputs that go into steel and all the inputs that go into cars, and then you have 5 or 6 people that are overseeing this entire huge amount of production, like literally these people would be running back and forth trying to solve day-to-day shortages. And sometimes they were very lucky, or they were very good, and they had contacts, and they, you know, kept great notes and had like a huge Rolodex. But a lot of times they didn't, because, you know, the error is human. And it was clear that this wasn't going to last. This wasn't going to work forever. They needed to have a system to like regulate all of these factories that they had taken over. And there was a young man who was in his 20s, I think, when he was working at the State Development Corporation that owned all these factories, and his name was Fernando Flores. And he had read a book, don't remember the name of the book, he had read a book written by a British academic named Stafford Beer. And Stafford Beer was an academic in a field that doesn't exist anymore. You can't really study what he studied back in the 60s. It was called cybernetics. And cybernetics was kind of like, it was the science of like decision, control, management. So it was bringing in things from like psychology, and he would give a lot of lectures to like capitalist businesses, saying if you want to increase production, if you want to have happier employees, like this is my system, and this literally over here was his system. And he would, you know, give presentations like a normal like management consultant today. But it also, so there was a psychological aspect to it, and, you know, management and all that. But he was also interested in like integrating technology more into the way that firms ran, because there were a lot of computers in a rich country like the US. There were like 500 computers in the early 1970s. But a lot of times they were just used to do things that had been done before, just faster. So you would do your spreadsheets 100 times faster. You would just do the work that used to take secretaries a few days, you would do in a couple minutes. And so they got this huge benefit, but everything else was still kind of running the same. Management wasn't really using data in a more efficient way. And Beer was saying, you got to change the whole way that you run your company, using technology, using, you know, these concepts that we're going to get into in a minute. And then you're going to really be using technology the right way. You're really going to, you know, kind of take off. And Flores was interested in that. He thought that Chile could use a lot of Stafford Beer's insights in running these firms that the state suddenly owned overnight. So he sent him a letter. Stafford Beer was very excited. He was a management consultant. He was like a businessman. He made a lot of money, but he was also kind of he was like a Labor Party supporter. And he wasn't quite a communist, but he was not. Like, everybody knew that when Salvador Allende was elected that he was a socialist and that he was a radical and he was going to take Chile along this path. Stafford Beer was not turned off by that. Unlike, I think, a lot of other people in his profession, he was actually kind of excited about it. So Flores sends a letter to Beer. Beer flies out to Santiago in, I erased it, but it was in July of that year. Or no, November. He gets the letter in July, he flies out in November. And he spends a few weeks talking with mainly managers and people that were kind of in the government bureaucracy and Chilean scientists to kind of get a feel, because he didn't know Spanish. I don't think he'd ever been to Latin America before. And Flores didn't know English, so when they first met, he was communicating with him in like broken Latin, because he was British, of course. He studied Latin in high school. So you can imagine, like, this guy is going to run an economy in a country that he doesn't even speak. He had to be brought up to speed by these, by Flores and a lot of his colleagues, and that happens after this. And so his ideas changed a lot. Stafford Beer's ideas changed a lot when he came to Chile, but this over here is sort of what he stepped off the plane with when he came from Britain. This is like the viable systems model is one of his like big ideas, and this is right here what he would draw on a board. Hypothetically, if he were like giving a presentation to a business, he would say, this is my model, this is the way you need to run your business. So one of the things about cybernetics is that it was interdisciplinary. It combined a lot of different disciplines together. And one of the things that Beer was very fond of was biology, looking at like the organism, and using that as a metaphor to explain the way that a government or a business or something else can be run. And so I wrote like the body down here, the cerebral cortex, the brain. He said that each organization, let's say it's a business that makes something really simple. I used t-shirts last time. Let's say it's a business that makes t-shirts. The people that actually like do the folding of the t-shirts or the sewing, the people who use their hands, like the workers that actually do the work that the business relies on, to him, they're at the lowest level of this kind of organism. They are the equivalent of the body, like the hand. If the company is me, right, then the workers are the hands and like the feet and the skin. They're the things that have the most immediate connection to, the outside world. And he said that you need to acknowledge that. You need to acknowledge that the hand doesn't really know what's going on with the rest of the body, but it also has the best, most accurate knowledge about, for instance, like what the board feels like or something like that. It knows better than any other part of the body, like what's really going on. But at the same time, it's not aware of like the bigger picture. So Beer was like, you have to integrate these two things together. And the way that you do that is that you build a system where there's tiers. The first tier is workers, the immediate kind of low-level people. The next tier are like their shop floor managers, the people that are just barely above them. And the next tier is like the manager of the whole factory. And each one of these people has a larger and larger kind of view of what's going on. And the further on you get all the way up to like the executive, level 5, and that's sort of the brain. And he would say things like, if you touch a hot stove, if your business touches a hot stove, in other words, if your workers are working in the plant and something goes wrong, right? Equivalent of like a machine breaking, or obviously there's immediate response. People like get out of the way and they stop production and like, oh shit, we gotta do something. The t-shirt machine is broken. For Beer, this is sort of like a human like putting his hand on a hot stove, and there's a pain signal that travels up. In this case, it travels up from level 1 to level 2, and maybe it reaches like all the way up to level 3. It goes past the hand, goes all the way up. It doesn't reach the very top. It doesn't reach the conscious brain. You don't have to tell the CEO that the machine broke unless it's like a catastrophic thing. But it reaches maybe like the cerebral cortex that handles like the automatic shit. And so, and if you've ever touched a hot stove, like you take your hand off pretty quickly. But your hand doesn't decide to move. Your hand doesn't really have that power. Your hand just communicates a signal up here. And you don't have to like go through like a Socratic dialogue in your head. You don't have to read a book to figure out if you need to take your hand off the hot stove. You just do it like automatically, like a reflex or something like that. So there was different levels of like recursion, which is another word from computer science that he incorporated into this. Some problems could be solved down here. And a lot of day-to-day problems were solved just by workers who could see at their little station something's wrong. Oh, I need to move the t-shirts over here. Okay, so that problem's fixed. But a whole machine breaking, obviously, that needs to be kicked up to the next level. And if they can't fix it, it needs to be kicked up to the level beyond that. And then eventually, if like the whole factory is blown up, then you probably need to talk to the top level, the executive, and they can figure out, okay, what just happened, So this is sort of this is the model that he stepped off the plane with. Like, this is how you run a firm. You give people control in their little area. You let them you give them autonomy in their kind of sphere, but you call for as much support as you need from higher and higher levels, but you keep things as low level as you can so that the manager, like the CEO, isn't running around folding t-shirts. He's not involved in every last little crisis. He only takes care of like the big stuff, and other stuff gets solved before it reaches him. And it gets, progressively higher levels depending on how serious the problem is. So that's kind of that's the viable systems model, or that's a part of it. That's the most important part of it. This is what Beer stepped off the plane with in Santiago. And through talking to, like I said, politicians and managers, not workers. Again, we're not talking to workers yet. And that's another, like, I should keep criticisms of Cybersyn. I should write that down. So the first one is that it's pretty bad handwriting. That says workers, and there's a question mark after it, because in this diagram, in the viable systems model, the lowest level is pretty stupid. They're not really responsible for much. And in the system that Beer ended up developing, at least the initial system that he proposed with all these with Fernando Flores and the rest of the Chilean research team, the workers were not trusted with a whole lot of power. So that's something we're going to get into hopefully at the end. So anyway, talking to people who knew what was going on in Chile, this is what Beer and the rest of the team proposed, and it's called Project Cybersyn. That's, we're finally getting to the subject of the talk. And there were three main components to the system. The first was just kind of communication. He wanted to build something called the CyberNet, which sounds very high tech, sounds very like extravagant and like James Bond or something like that. It was made up of a series of electronic typewriters called telex machines that were like, it's like Stone Age text messaging. You would type something in, type the word hello, hit the send key. It would encode it, sort of like Morse code a little bit. It would send it through a phone line to another telex machine that would read it out and print it. And you could have a real-time conversation with somebody. Typically, though, people would type up big documents ahead of time, like a report or something like that, and then connect the machine, send it, and do that. And the idea was to put these telex machines in all the different factories. And I picked cars, empanadas, and red wine here for my examples. And each one would have and this actually, I didn't mention this, this comes from Allende. He said, we're going to have democratic change, we're going to have slow movements towards socialism, it's going to be done with the consent of everybody. We're going to have socialism with red wine and empanadas. That's going to be our path, like it's going to be beautiful. So that's why I picked these two things, because it's an Allende quote. Anyway, so there would be a telex machine in each one of these factories. It would communicate with one of the 4 computers in all of Chile. There's 500 in the US at this time. There's 4 in Chile, so that gives you some idea of like the gap here. And a lot of them were being used. They didn't have full use of all the computing space because it was needed for other things the state was doing, or it was needed for research. So they got one computer, but they built a network still with this one computer using these machines. And all the data that came in from all the different factories every day would be fed into a program running on one of these computers called Cyberstride. And Cyberstride was a model of the Chilean economy. They would take the car production number and say, okay, we're producing this many cars. And we know, because we've done the research, that in order to build this many cars, you need this many tons of rubber, this much steel, this much aluminum. You need electronics that are of a certain type or whatever. And they knew you need, 1 thing of rubber, 2 things of steel, 1 thing of electronics for 1 car. So if we want to make 1,000 cars, we need, 2,000 things of steel. And then that number would get fed to the steel factory over here, the rubber plantation or factory over here, the electronics factory over here. So there was a model that you could put 1 number in and you could get, the rest of the economy. Or you could tell, so that was one thing. You could make a plan. You could say, we want to produce this many things next year. And Cyberstride would help you figure out exactly what that meant in terms of like what you needed to produce. It could also do, and this is kind of preliminary, they didn't really finish this, it was also supposed to be able to predict the future. So, for instance, if we're talking about like coal, and there's coal over here, then there's steel, then there's cars. If there was a sudden, like what we had at Kennecott, if there was like a landslide and part of the mine was closed, that would send a signal, sort of like a signal over here, which travels through all the different levels. That would send a signal like, oh, we're going to run out of coal, or we're going to have much less coal tomorrow because we just had a collapse. That signal could be transmitted instantly into the Cyberstride program, which would say, okay, we have less coal. So I'm going to send a message to everybody further up along the chain, to the steel plant, to the car place, to the place that's waiting for the cars or something like that, to everybody that's even remotely involved in this coal mine collapsing. I'm going to send a signal saying, expect, to the steel mill, expect less coal, to the car plant, expect less steel, and then what would normally be kind of a series of like market fluctuations where the price for coal goes way up and then goes way down, and production adjusts relatively late. Like you're thinking you're going to make a certain amount of steel, and then everybody's waiting around for resources that can't arrive because no coal is coming. Instead of having all those things going on, Cyberstride and this network were supposed to be able to communicate in real time, like within a day. That was their goal. Whenever anything was wrong in the economy and exactly who it affected. And then the interventors and the managers of all these different factories would be able to like change their plans again in real time. And that was, I think the closest they got was like 2 days. It was never quite real time because there was always a lag in collecting the data, because it wasn't collected automatically. It was collected by people going out and asking, you know, the workers what was going on, and then they would compile the, you know, the what they got into a report and then submit it, you know, to their manager, and then the manager would maybe forget about it, or maybe he would send it in because he was a, you know, real go-getter. But like the shortest time that they conceived of was a day, and it never got beyond 2 days. There was one story that I read in this book that involved coal. There was a guy who was running a steel plant for the state, and he noticed that there was a shortage of coal. So he ran over to the coal mine and said, "What's going on?" And they said, "Oh, we had a problem. It'll be fixed tomorrow. Don't worry, we'll send extra trucks filled with coal when we get it." And he was like, "Okay, that's cool. All right." Not using the system at all, not relying or waiting for the data to go through all these correct channels. And then he went back to his job. Everything was fine for a couple of days. And then he gets a message over the cybernet from the people in Santiago, where this, the capital, where the machine that ran this software was based. He gets this alert saying, "Hey, you have a shortage of coal. You're running out of coal." And it was useless to him by then because he'd already solved the problem. But the fact that he even got that message in the first place, that was kind of what this system was intended to do. It just never quite caught up to the demands of real time. Which, I mean, that's still pretty good though for 1970, considering that it was a computer network with only one computer. So the next thing up here, this weird looking diagram, was the war room. And this was like the top level. It was a room like about this big, and it was supposed to take all the data from Cyberstride and kind of present it on the walls. There were like these special screens that they built that would present all this data. There was like 8 chairs. They figured out that 8 people is the maximum that can come to a reasonable consensus while still having a large amount of like diversity of opinion or something like that. So that's from Stafford Beer. That's his kind of study of business. He had some input in how this room was designed. And in the room, you couldn't write anything on paper. Paper was not allowed. There were no tables or pens. There was a bar, but there was no like, no means for like presenting reports in a formal way. It was supposed to be kind of like a brainstorming room where 8 people would go in, and they were, you know, it was designed so that you wouldn't need any technical expertise to understand the diagrams. You wouldn't need any technical expertise to like manipulate the data and get it to show up in different ways. It was designed so that any 8 people could be thrown into the room, although in practice it was supposed to be like government ministers and managers and stuff like that, and that they could look at all the data around them and kind of formulate a general plan based on what this software had figured out for them. And that was like the last level of the project. And that was never, they prototyped it out. They made these really funky looking chairs. And if you look at an article for Project Cybersyn, that's probably one of the things you see. It's like this weird, like wood paneled shag carpet, like extremely 70s room that has all this weird data projected on the walls, and it's kind of apparently a bar too. And that was mocked up, but it was never actually used to like run in interaction with the Cyberstride software. It was just, they were planning on doing it. They actually installed that room, the war room, in the palace, the presidential palace, like 2 days before September 11th, 2 days before the coup, that, you know, bombed the palace and caused Allende to shoot himself. So that this thing was, you know, the cybernet was fully implemented, and the government would make use of that a lot. Cyberstride was partially implemented and sort of worked. The war room was basically a pipe dream, except until the very, very end. So that's a system that Beer proposed. And so that happens through 1971, early 1972. They start moving out into the factories, installing these machines, teaching people about it. Not teaching workers, again, nobody's talking about workers yet. They were only teaching managers and like the state employees that were responsible for running these things how to make use of this network. And throughout this whole period, actually even before Allende was formally sworn in, the CIA was watching him like a hawk. Nixon already didn't like him. There was a lot of domestic opposition to him from landowners and factory owners who were afraid that he was going to nationalize their assets, which he did. Right? He wasn't, that was his plan. So there was opposition to him before he was even sworn in. The CIA actually tried to convince some people on this assembly that picked the president to not pick him. They tried to get some other guy to come forward, and so anyway, there was interference with the economy too, directly from the beginning. There was this stealth blockade that the U.S. implemented because a lot of these Chilean factories still had equipment from the U.S. and they needed spare parts when things broke, and the U.S. told everybody that had factories in Chile, do not send them spare parts. Just don't let them figure it out. Don't send them anything. So there was prolonged outages and problems in factories just because Allende was elected. There was economic sabotage from the beginning. But there was also, like I said, domestic opposition. The first kind of big instance of that was the strike in October 1972, which is sort of a strike. It's more of a lockout because what happened is factory owners would close their factories down, the factories that weren't owned by the state yet. They would put padlocks on the factories, tell the workers to go home. And a lot of truck drivers who in Chile, as in the United States, I guess, are a reactionary force. They own their own trucks, and they didn't want to go along with this socialist government because they were afraid that he was going to take their trucks or something. And they blocked the roads. So there was factory managers closing the factories that were not nationalized yet. There were truck drivers blocking the roads. And when workers tried to reopen factories, there were groups of anti-government protesters that would attempt to stop them, keep people from getting into the factories.
They call those scabs.
Right, scabs. Yeah, and at this time, the CIA is both hands all over Chilean politics. They're sending money to all kinds of people. There's a story that I think is verified that they would pay, one of these opposition groups that got money from the CIA would pay people to go into a store, buy all of a particular commodity like sugar and just dump it in the river to create a consumer shortage, a shortage of basic goods, which, whatever. So that was going on. That's been called a strike or a lockout, but this goes through most of October. And the government defeated the strike. Yeah?
I was going to say, it's around the same time that I'm thinking it's kind of convenient that it's around almost the same exact time as our fuel crisis during the 70s, I believe.
Yeah, I don't know when that was, but
it just seems like it is.
Yeah. Well, any year in the 1970s, the CIA was doing fucked up things somewhere.
Yeah,
so.
Also finding a sort of fighting addition. What is it called again when a factory owner closes their own factory? Do we call that a strike?
There is such a thing as an investment strike, where you don't.
Okay, so
I don't know.
investors were striking.
Yeah, I like the lockout though. I think is the better term because they literally would just lock the place up and say, nope, nobody's. So.
How was that initially handled? The mass lockout. How was that handled by the government?
Initially, the government was kind of paralyzed by it, and eventually it responded using this telex network because there were a few truck drivers that remained loyal to the government, and there was 200 in the whole country. And they were able to, because they had this instant communications capability that didn't exist before, they were able to strategically relocate trucks and prioritize key industries and kind of restart production, even though very few trucks were available. They were able to, the coal, for instance, send the coal to the right place, send the steel to the right place. And they worked these guys like crazy, but they did manage to get through the strike. But in the very beginning, before the network even came in, and this is kind of a key event, the October strike is the beginning of the end for the Allende government. It's the first proof of the worth of the Cybersyn system. And it also changed a lot of people's ideas about Stafford Beer in particular. The October strike, seeing workers break open factory gates and march in and restart production and coordinate things on their own, and then telling the government later, oh no, this factory is fine, it's still open, we're still working. these guys tried to come and close it, we beat them up or something like that. And by the way, we found a few trucks. So, I mean, this kind of spontaneous, like, self-organizing thing happened during the October strike, because, as we would find out in early 1973, when Allende's coalition got more of the vote than it did in 1970, there was still a tremendous amount of support for his government. It was not this, this repressive kind of, like, government of goons that was, beating these defenseless landlords or something like that. They had a tremendous amount of support from ordinary people, and that was, realized during the October strike when, again, people were taking factories over and running them, and the government was finding out about it and very happy to find out about it, but didn't really have anything to do with it to start with. So it was a combination, though, of this network that the government had, this kind of nationwide perspective, and also the local actions of, like, individual like, groups of workers. So.
I was just going to because I saw that something. It could have worked, but I don't know if they would have done it. Like, say, for instance, you had some sectors that were still, like, not nationalized yet, where they had lockouts. It's like you have a ton of worker ants, so to speak, but you don't have any way to, like, make them worthy of working there. So why not have those those little worker ants, like, migrate to other types of, like, production, and then increase your labor force there to on top of the ones that you need. Or
Yeah, well, the nationalization program was sort of uneven. There were certain sectors that, like, the government had less influence in, and I think in certain cases they needed the factory open, like, they needed that particular factory to be producing in order, for the rest of the economy in that area to, like, stay working. So, I mean, and the other thing is there's a certain amount of capacity, like, in each factory. You can't just pour, like, 1,000 extra people into a car plant. I mean, because there's only a certain amount of places. But ultimately, I think relocating resources, that was something that this system was designed to make easier, I guess. So anyway, that is in October. The government doesn't, this is another difference with a strike. Like, in a normal strike, the employer, like, starves the employees out. In this strike, the employers just kind of gave up. They were just like, fuck it. Like, they're, because obviously they were eating still. They weren't, destitute. But they realized that it's not going to work, that the government is fairly resilient, has a lot of support. So that ends. That's the first of, I think there were 3 major strikes like that, and all of them failed, even though they got progressively, like, more serious. But the government was able to kind of limp through all of them, or even, pass with flying colors in the case of this one. So then, like I said earlier, we get to early 1973, the last year of the Allende presidency. There's an election. Allende's coalition wins more seats, and this is actually kind of the beginning of the end for his government. In a normal liberal democracy that wasn't being fucked with by the CIA and wasn't filled with paranoid landowners and factory owners, this would have been the end of it. They would have said, okay, well, we can't do anything. I guess we're just going to wait for the next election and run a really great campaign and get our slogans out there, because clearly we can't, defeat Allende right now. He has too much support. This was actually the nail in the coffin, because they realized that there was no way to remove Allende through the democratic process. There was no way to remove him through protests. So the only option left to the opposition was to stage a coup, which they tried to do that in June. The tanquetazo, I guess, is what that's called, the tank putsch in Spanish. And that was a single tank battalion that surrounded the presidential palace and started shooting at it, and called on the people and the rest of the military to rise up against this dictator. Nobody responded, although the military was watching, down to the point where they figured out who was firing at the soldiers, like the rebelling soldiers during this attempt at a coup. They figured out, like, where the loyal army units' positions were during this coup, and they wrote it down, and they're like, okay, the next time we try this, we're going to know to fire on this sector and that area and put some people over. So, I mean, this was like a trial run. It wasn't necessarily supposed to succeed, and it didn't. Just a few months later, though, on September 11th, 1973, General Pinochet, over here, the last name, on our list. Stages a military coup. Within a year, he's consolidated power, forced all the rest of the generals out, and started the dictatorship that ruled, I think, until it was 16 years. So that would be 89.
89.
Yeah. So ruled until 89, and there was it was sort of like in Spain, like Franco died, and then gradually there was this transition in democracy. It sort of happened that way in Chile. There was a national vote, and Pinochet basically had to give up power. But that only happened after 16 years, and tens of thousands of people were killed or thrown in camps. Allende, if he hadn't killed himself, definitely would have been killed by the government. And there's a lot of people like Fernando Flores had to leave the country and go into hiding. And it's kind of funny, he actually moved to Silicon Valley and became a business consultant, sort of like what Stafford Beer was in the 50s, and kind of disavowed everything that he did on Project Cybersyn. But for Stafford Beer, the experience of the October strike, seeing his system be used, not used, seeing his system be kind of surpassed by the activity of workers who, again, are like level 1 of his system, not really supposed to have, they're not supposed to know everything about what's going on, they're not really supposed to be able to organize themselves. During October, Beer's ideas on cybernetics, his ideas on how you run an economy changed completely, and he was proposing much more radical things after October, even though the position of the government was like very tenuous, and it was, you know, the support for a peaceful resistance to Allende was evaporating, and the military option was becoming more and more prominent. But at the same time, Beer was like off in the clouds, thinking about how much more democratic and like responsive to people's needs at a low level his system could be. And he eventually realized and said this, that, you know, the only people who really have direct knowledge and the useful knowledge of production are workers, and that if they don't have a say in everything that goes on, if they don't have a way to run the economy at a macro level, then the system is, you know, to some extent not responsive and not efficient, according to like his original, you know, because his thing is efficiency, right? And he realized that if you don't have control by people who really actually know what's going on, then you can't really, you know, claim to have efficiency. And anybody who's had a boss, I guess, could like attest to how much a boss knows and how much an employee knows about like the way things work in a workplace. So look at my notes here. Oh yeah, this other guy, I forgot to mention him, Eduardo Montalva. He was the leader of Christian Democracy, which was like not a junior partner, it was one of the biggest partners in Allende's Popular Unity coalition that won both of these elections. And he was one of the people who, he was not in the military, he was not that conservative, he was fairly liberal. Christian Democracy was, you know, alongside the Communist Party and the Socialist Party and Allende's coalition. So they weren't on the right, but he was very concerned that Allende was going way too far. And eventually he kind of tacitly agreed that the military should try to remove him, you know. And his fate is pretty interesting because he protested the Allende government and eventually led to the military taking control of the country. In the early 80s, he started speaking out against the Pinochet government, and he was poisoned when he went into the hospital for like routine surgery, like he had to have his appendix removed or something trivial like that, and he died of this extremely obvious, like, you know, horrendous poison directly for criticizing the government. And that was actually one of the things, his death was one of the many things that led people to, you know, become extremely fed up with the military government and led to the, you know, the end of Pinochet's rule. But I think his story is interesting because he was one of these people who was opposed to Allende and was able to criticize Allende, even was able to participate in something that you could call treasonous against the government that was technically elected in Chile. And he didn't suffer any consequences from Allende. When he was eventually killed, it was not by this Marxist radical that was supposedly out to destroy everything, he was killed by the government that he thought was going to save Chile. So there's a lot of like tragic aspects to this story, and I think Montalva is kind of one of the many tragic figures. The other one is Allende himself, killing himself shooting himself in the head with a rifle on September 11th, 1973. The rifle that he shot himself with was a gift from Fidel Castro that had a plaque on it that said, to my brother, Salvador, who is trying to do in Chile by different means what we've already done in Cuba. So it's like you couldn't write like a better like Greek tragedy or whatever. I mean, he's shooting himself with there's like the whole lesson of this thing is like engraved in the weapon that he's shooting himself with, So anyway, that is the history of Project Cybersyn. I want to talk a little bit about, because I just kind of described like what happened and what people said. I'd like to talk a little bit about my interpretation of it, but I want to take questions first from people if there are any. Yeah.
Don't take too much time on this, but like I heard different stories about Cyberstride and like
yeah.
Somebody said he got shot in the back actually, but like
right.
One that I read because I was kind of curious is that they actually found 2 bullets
and
one like wasn't from an AK-47, it's from like a pistol.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I feel like at that point, like whatever happened on this day, it's sort of like academic because the tanks were like firing at the palace, and the government was going to shoot him. So it's like if they shot him, then they shot him, but they were also like firing tank shells at the house that he lived in. So it's like, sort of like, oh my God, the government killed, like the military government killed Allende. Like, well, yeah, they had tanks, they were shooting, So I don't know. I feel like he just got there first, probably. But it's not
important.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like Martin Luther King, who really killed Martin Luther King. And if it was the government, that's a huge deal. But because the government wasn't already like shooting tanks at his hotel.
No. They had some documents on that, like when ClientServer book
right.
came out, so they actually, when he was going to be on that balcony, they actually had like X marks over the balcony where he was going to be standing at to like his audiences and stuff like that. I mean, it's the same thing with a couple of other major activist people here in the U.S. Malcolm X is another example. But it's just funny to me because it's like a lot of what you're all just talking about here with the October blackout and stuff like that, the strike. It sounds so much like it could have been like counterintelligence networking down there just for the sake of bigger U.S. interest in.
Well, there was absolutely, and there was this book that I read, and I should like cite my sources. This whole presentation comes from a book by a lady named Eden Medina called Cybernetic Revolutionaries. It's pretty good. It's like $10 on Amazon to get the Kindle copy. So anyway, in that book she talks about a meeting between some CEO. It was either the head of IBM or the head of like a mining firm or something like that. But it was a 3-way meeting between like the head of the CIA, the head of a prominent U.S. corporation with significant investments in Chile, and President of the United States. And it's like those 3 together in a room plotting the fate of a government that was barely elected, but was elected in a completely free, fair, certified, legit election. And I read that and I was like, that's ridiculous. And there were, because right after this, the Church Committee, like right after the early 70s, the Church Committee released a ton of documents pertaining to like secret CIA activities, and that's the only reason we know about a lot of this stuff. But there was just like cartoonishly, almost James Bond like levels of evil. I mean, like the CIA and a fat cat, and it's like something that you would read and be like, this is ridiculous. Like there's no, you would see that in a James Bond movie and say, these guys, what are they doing? This is way over the top. It's not really like this, but in the case of Chile, it actually was. So, yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think that your research into Cybersyn has told us about, like, say, for instance, the ability to central plan, the ability for workers to actually make decisions, be able to collaborate without the use of market mechanisms for absolute justice, and maybe even revolutionary information technology.
Well, I think the original design of Cybersyn and a lot of Beer's ideas don't really mesh with socialism as well as people think. I think that this kind of, giving people control, which in practice meant giving managers control to kind of decide what was going on in a factory, even if groups of managers are communicating laterally with each other, and even if they're basing their decisions on like hard data, it's still, the relationship between the average worker and the average manager hasn't really changed that much. So the original design of Cybersyn, I don't think, is like conducive. I mean, it was clearly a central planning system, and in that sense, it's interesting. But I don't think it was improving like the lives of ordinary workers, except in the fact that it was like producing more stuff for them to buy, like cheaper, I guess. And that's good. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think the designs that Beer started proposing after the October strike that were never implemented, that were never really seriously discussed, those are much closer to what you're talking about, the ability of like participatory planning and using technology to like empower workers to organize their own workplaces and like directly control what they're doing. So, but I think that is not necessarily, I mean, something like Cyberstride is a great idea, the model, but ultimately, like, if for the model to be good enough, it needs to be very, very complex. You need to have, individual factories modeled and their relationships, and you need to have everything just right. You need to have the latest data. You need to have mechanisms to put that into the model as quickly as possible. And eventually, like, the complexity, I mean, if you want to really get down to it, this model has to be exactly as complex as the economy that you're trying to manage in order for it to be, like, really, really useful, right? And you can abstract some things, and you don't have to get all the way there in order to have Cyberstride be useful, but the more complex it gets, the harder it is to manage, but also the more accurate it is. So there's this constant, like, tension. And I think the design that Beer proposed later, or that Beer discussed later, where workers would have much more say in the running of their individual factory, and would be way more informed about the whole state of the economy, and able to like discuss things on a national level directly, and not just be part of these kind of feedback loops that are only connected to each other like conditionally when something goes wrong. I think that later idea is it makes use of data like Cyberstride does, but it doesn't need to concentrate it in this huge complex system that's really difficult to understand. Because the whole thing is like everything, all the data that was being collected, that data could have been used at a local level. That data could have been used in small parts by the people directly involved in it. But instead of being used down here, it was sent all the way up, and then things were sent all the way down again. And Cyberstride is good for taking a lot of data and producing like a little report for people to read in a war room. But ultimately, the economy could have been better managed if instead of producing a report for 8 people, the information had been used where it was generated, and by as many people as possible. And this is actually like one of the arguments against socialism that people like Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek presented. One of the arguments is the information argument, that in the market, technically everybody is making decisions. Everybody is using, they're gathering as much information as they can. And in a central planning system, if you have 8 people, or whoever can fit in the war room, then there's a limited amount of information that these people can process. And Cyberstride can increase that amount of information, but it can never come close to like what the whole market can do. And that's one of the arguments that Hayek and Friedman presented as to why socialism will never work, because it can't deal with all this information. And I think that can also be applied sort of to Cybersyn. But the response to that is then, well, involve as many people as you can at this low level in the decision making. Don't, abolish socialism. Just spread decision making out to people that are actually affected by it, to people that have the information because they're right in front of the machine that's, producing whatever it is, it's the job of the firm to produce. So, yeah.
Would that limitation only be salient in a client and server model? Or like, say, for instance, if you only had one server to run the entire economy,
right,
as opposed to, like, say, distributed computing and also distributed knowledge throughout, like, wouldn't that rather be a structure of information technology at the time?
Yeah.
Which could have been handled by markets insofar as they are efficient at certain things and inefficient, but computers, like, say, for instance, if you consider the information technology of the U.S. military to keep everybody fed and to keep bullets in everybody's guns, it seems totally adequate.
Right, yeah.
Would you agree with that assessment?
I still think there's a problem of, like, management. If there's only 10 people or 100 people who really have decision-making power, even if they have information, there's always questions like, is the model accurate? Is the model right? And at this level, at the low level, the model's right. Like, that people that are confronting, like, directly what's going on in a factory, that they know what they're doing because they can't avoid it. They see it. They see it every day, and they see it for much longer than anybody else does. I do think that computers, because these arguments, the information argument, for instance, was first advanced in the 1920s, well before there was any kind of electronic computer at all, however basic. So I do think that computers and technology have changed that equation, that, like, if the USSR had barcodes and barcode scanners and, like, personal computers in the 1920s, that the economy would have been a lot more efficient and socialism would have been easier to build. But I still think there would have been a political problem related to, partially to information, like how many, because there's always a question like, how do you collect the data? Are you collecting the right data? How are you combining it? And there can always be problems with that in making the transition from, like, the low level to the high level. But if it's kept lower, then those problems are eliminated, and the decision making is much closer to what's going on. And that's, I don't know, that's what I...
We should talk more about this.
One thought that I was having with this model that I was noticing is that, without the workers as having to say, so to speak, in this management, wouldn't that lead to a lot of kind of corruption within an organization?
Yeah.
Ultimately, one of the downsides to it.
Right. And yeah, you go. Sorry, I interrupted you.
That's one theory I was thinking of, but I think ultimately that kind of comes down to any kind of government system, is that there is going to be corruption somewhere amongst the the chain of command, so to speak.
Yeah. And actually, one of the groups that sort of opposed Project Cybersyn was the Chilean Communist Party, which is weird to think about. But they had a very interesting reason for opposing it. It was mainly taught to managers. It was for managers to communicate with other managers even higher up in the hierarchy. And it seriously undermined the power of the unions that the communists were running in all these different state-managed factories. And one of the reasons why it undermined the power of unions is that it concentrated decision-making power, in a thin kind of like strata of officials at the very top. But it also gave these people the sanction of, like, being the experts, right? Because they had the software, they had access to all the data, and so they really knew what was going on, and they could tell the union, like, well, we don't need as many people here as we did before, and we're not capitalists. We're not trying to fuck you guys over, but we've done the calculations. Like, we have all this data that we've crunched, we've put it into this shiny new computer system that we have, and the results are not looking good for 10% of the workforce or something like that. So they were absolutely against that. And you can understand why, like, people have a right to control their workplace, people have a right to, democracy wherever they are in their lives. And this system, in some ways, did undermine that. And I think could have caused, like you mentioned, corruption. And that it would have concentrated, the power to maybe fudge numbers or skim things off the top, like delete. We produced one less car today than we actually did, and that one car is mysteriously going to end up in my garage later tonight, something like that. So, whereas if everybody was watching where the cars went, if everybody was, responsible for counting how many cars were taken away, and you see the manager leaving with one, and you're on the factory committee, you're going to be like, get back here.
I was going to say, it does sound like it undermines democracy because it hides information the lower that you get on the
Yeah.
hole, so to speak.
Right, and Beer said that he wanted to start training workers in how to use this system, and in training them to read like the reports that Cyberstride produced, and you can see how that would kind of improve democracy, but just giving people information without giving them like control over something to do with that information is only kind of part of it. So I think Beer did recognize what you're talking about. Eventually, he recognized it after the October strike, but before then, he was thinking more in this kind of like, computer science major mode where we have the right technology, we know what we're doing, All we need to do is just build the model and then,
It sounds a lot like an information Ponzi scheme if you look at it that way.
Well, that's technocracy, that's what that's called. And people, that was a slur that Beer didn't like technocracy at all. He thought he was doing something different, and I think he was, but it was not as different as he thought, I don't think. So.
Yeah, obviously there's lots I want to talk to you about, but don't you think that evaluation about managers versus line workers and things like that presupposes a sort of antagonism of management versus workers, and that if you actually make it so that the workers are responsible for choosing their own managers and setting the ends of the factory, that actually eliminates not only the clutter of choices which exists so much today in our society that actually prevents people from making clear and intelligible choices, but actually makes it so that those managers' ends are set towards the ends of the workers rather than the factory owners,
right.
Which that antagonism did exist, at least partially in Chile for a lot of factories. But once you eliminate that, there's no real harm in having managers.
Right.
I mean, it's just a matter of distributing jobs and workforces. Some people are better at managing, some people are better at making widgets.
Exactly, yeah. And if that had been implemented, that would have been great. But there was always this like cultural and class divide that carried over from the Chile before that.
But that's not a theoretical problem then.
Right, yeah.
The problem that management
No, not at all.
is in control of decision making. And on top of that, for this sort of more top-down model, since not everybody can be fully aware of what the needs are of everybody, like say for instance, if I work in a Nike factory, right, and you manufacture rubber, and then somebody else here manufactures, like say for instance, DVD players, it's not really within my purview to be able to have decisions about what's going on in that factory there, all the way over there. But if we have it so that we've elected leaders and leaders keep our ends democratically in mind, then there's no problems with having managers that is able to have a more centralized view and able to guide those ends so that they work in coalition together, as opposed to a nobody rules anybody goes topology, if you will.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, yeah.
So what you're saying is that, and I want you to say this to the camera because it doesn't pick up my questions.
Okay.
What I want you to say into the
Wait,
birdie,
it doesn't pick up your questions? What do you mean?
No, it just picks up you.
Oh, just like, so are we hearing everybody else?
No.
We're not?
No, they just pick up your
Oh
questions.
shit, okay. I didn't know that.
You didn't know.
If I had known that, I would have like repeated the,
All right. Well,
because the last video that we did, everything showed up. We heard everybody.
yeah, but that's because
damn.
Can be heard well.
Okay, all right.
But anyway,
Like Greg was louder than me. Greg was like, 4 times louder than I was. So I thought that would carry through what we did.
anyway, so you would say then that this top-down model is only a problem in antagonistic relationships between workers and factories.
Yes, the top-down model is more of a problem, or only a problem when managers do not represent the interests of workers. When there's this kind of class relationship. There's only you are a manager or you are a worker, and you cannot, change spots. And there's no election. There's no like consensus building in management. It's all we have the data, you don't. We know what's going on, and you do what we say. So, all right. Any other questions? No? Okay. Thank you.